Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel. Interesting. Dr. Vanden Eykel, he is a scholar, and he wrote a book on the Magi, the mystical figures that show up in Jesus's birth narrative in Matthew. And we're going to be talking about who these Magi were, where they came from. We're going to be talking about what their purpose is in the narrative, and a lot of essentially things that cultural, we believe in the culture about these people that showed up in Jesus' narrative that aren't actually true. So we're going to debunk some myths there. So how are you doing today, Dr. Vanden Eykel?
I am doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, awesome. I'm going to call you Eric. I know you already introduced yourself as Eric when we met in person, actually. Like, you're like one of 3 scholars I've met in person, so that's fun.
Yeah.
I'm gonna call you Eric. But everybody in the comments, you have to Vanden Eykel. It has to be Dr. Vanden Eykel. Respect.
Well, I'll answer to whatever, but thank you.
So first of all, let's start with the Matthew story with the Magi. What happens in this narrative? I'm basically asking you, what is the birth narrative in Matthew? But could you explain a little summary of that, just so people understand what we're coming from, where these people show up?
Yeah, so Matthew has a story of visitors to Jesus after his birth, just like Luke does, but the stories are 2 very, very different stories in terms of who visits and the circumstances. And so in Matthew, the story of the Magi just starts with, when Jesus was born, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, and they ask about a figure that they call the King of the Judeans. And they say, where is the one who has been born King of the Judeans? And the people in Jerusalem say, well, they sort of consult their scriptures or their documents or whatever, and they say the figure that you're looking for is supposed to be found in Bethlehem. And then, and I of course left out a really important part. They say, "Where's the one who's been born the King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising." Right? We saw his star in the east, and so this whole idea is that they see this star, and they head west to Jerusalem. Excuse me. And then when they get to Jerusalem, the authorities there send them to Bethlehem, which is south of Jerusalem. And when they depart Jerusalem, the star reappears. It leads them to a house. It stops over the house. They present gifts to Jesus. And then they're warned in a dream to not go back to Jerusalem. And then they head back to their own country. And that's basically it. So they also, this whole scene of them presenting gifts, we would talk, I'm sure, about a lot of this stuff, bowing down and worshiping Jesus. That's basically it. It's a really, really short story. Mm-hmm. And after they disappear, the only reference to them in Matthew is right after, where Herod gets pissed off because they've left without telling him where Jesus is, and so he goes and murders a lot of children.
Definitely a reasonable idea, considering.
Right. Perfectly normal.
Yes, of course. So this is really interesting because we know a lot about this Magi group. Kind of. There's a lot of different references to this word and kind of this people group. But at the same time, we don't know a ton. Right. But you've written a whole book on it because it is very exhaustive as all the different resources we have. But one of the, actually, I don't know if this is true. I guess this wouldn't be if it's Daniel. But this word Magi, it is mentioned in Daniel 2 of the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. One of the really funny things that I and also I just saw a comment. Hi, John. How's it going? So one of the really interesting things that I discovered when I was doing the research for my book, when I did a kind of rough outline of what I thought I was going to find, right? That's how research kind of starts. It's like, what do you think you're going to find? What do you hope you're going to find? And then you adjust along the way. I had hopes to write an entire chapter of like magi in the Old Testament, or the Greek, magi is a Greek word. And so it's going to be in the Septuagint. And so I had this grand plan to write an entire big chapter on like the Old Testament backgrounds of this term. And it turns out it never appears except for Greek Daniel. And in Greek Daniel, it's also really, really not all that prominent, but it's there. And in this text, what happens is that the group that Daniel and his cohort are kind of incorporated into, they have a few different classifications, one of them being magoi. And so there is a sense in Greek Daniel, at least, that there is a group of kind of advisory figures in Babylon who help the kings understand visions and dreams and these sorts of things. And you don't really find these in the Hebrew as much, because these are Greek terms. But yeah, you see there on the text that you've got up here, the enchanters, the apaidus, the magus, and the pharmacus, the pharmacists, basically. So yeah, the magi are sort of, or at least one part of this group that Daniel's part of is described as being magoi. And so yeah, you do have at least one reference, or really just one reference in the Septuagint to magi in the Old Testament, suggesting that either Daniel is a magus, or he's sort of closely affiliated with that group.
Right. Yep. So really disappointing there that it's basically not mentioned at all.
Right. No, that was like, well, crud. I'm going to have to. But it turns out there's actually more than I thought there would be in Greek literature outside the Septuagint. So that was a good.
So we don't have to end the interview here. So appreciate that.
Yeah.
That's good. All right. And yeah, so tell me how they are described in other texts outside of the New Testament, basically the Christian Bible.
Yeah. So one of the things that they all have in common, or most of them have in common, is that in all of the stories related to magi one of my primary sources in the book is Herodotus. And Herodotus has lots and lots and lots to say about magi. But in these texts, magi are people who are coming to pay tribute to kings. Magi are people who are I was going to say literary professionals. That's not a thing. Ritual specialists, religious professionals, and they are also generally found in royal context. So they're traveling around with kings. They're giving kings different, types of advice, interpreting various different phenomena as well. If a temple gets destroyed, you call the magi and try to figure out what's going on. If you have a weird dream, you call the magi to figure out what's going on. There's sort of a common theme here. If something happens to you, or if something happens in the world that doesn't really have any meaning for anyone else, the magi are the ones who can find out what it means, or can tell you what it means, either because they have a direct link to God, or because they are really good at just discerning and or making things up. Yeah.
Okay. And so yeah, that's obviously a very condensed version. So there is an aspect that's really important of, like, they often show up when people are becoming kings. Is that right?
Either people becoming kings, or a change in power, a change of kings, or sometimes they're just hanging out, kind of in the court of the king as an advisory figure. But the king part is really important because, in a lot of the biblical scholarship that I surveyed before really even knowing what this book was, the fixation of New Testament scholars is just so narrow, and really, frankly, just not correct. They say, oh, the magi are astrologers from the East. Like, well, I mean, maybe, but also the funny thing is that's not even a major piece of who they are in ancient cognate literature. There's not like chapters and chapters and chapters. There's probably a couple references to them seeing stars and finding significance in that, but they're far more frequently associated with royalty, which is interesting that like commentaries tend to miss this, right? They don't generally focus on the Magi there to legitimate Jesus's kingship. The commentaries focus on the Magi as these kind of astrology nuts who just follow stars around and whatever. Yeah.
Fascinating. And that's really important because in this narrative, this text of Matthew 2, as we'll see on the screen, they show up. It's really interesting because they go to King Herod first.
Correct.
So, what's the significance of that? It's my understanding. Maybe I got this from you or somebody else. It's that they weren't necessarily being led by the star yet.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah. If you look at the story, and I'm glad you have it up here. If you look at the story, Matthew's story does not say that the Magi followed a star to Bethlehem. It just doesn't. And what it says is that they, sorry, let me back up. There's really two different stars here. The stars have two different personalities. The star that they go to Jerusalem because of does not lead them to Jerusalem. So we have this image in our mind from, like Christmas pageants, nativities, these sorts of things, of these dudes, traversing the desert, and there's a big, huge, bright star in front of them, and they're just following it. They're like, we don't know where we're going, but we're going to follow the star. That's just not what happens in Matthew. What happens in Matthew is that they simply go to Jerusalem and they say, where is the one who's been born King of the Judeans? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. The idea being, we saw his star when it rose, and then we knew what its significance was, and so then we came here. So they're playing with a trope here from the ancient world in general, but from the Hebrew Bible more specifically, or Matthew is playing with this trope. And that trope is that when you have a king who comes to power, that is often signified by a rising star. And so you have this reference, the verses and chapters are gonna escape me because I'm bad at numbers, but in Numbers, that was an unintentional pun. I'm bad with numbers, but also in the book of Numbers, there's a prophet named Balaam, and Balaam gives this oracle where he talks about a star rising out of Jacob, a star rising up, and this is meant to signal the rising, the coming of a new political and probably military leader. And there's a lot of people who have suggested that Matthew is here playing off of Balaam's oracle of the star rising up. But you find the reverse as well in Isaiah 14, which is not about the devil. It's about the king of Babylon. And I know that because Isaiah 14 says it's about the king of Babylon. Oh, how fallen are you, day star, son of the morning, right? This whole idea is that the king of Babylon is being told your reign has come to an end. And so Matthew here is playing with this whole idea of the Magi seeing a star rise, and they are able, because they're Magi, they are able to see, aha, this means that the rightful king of the Judeans has been born. And so you can imagine them sitting around like, well, let's go see him. Well, where should we go? Well, where would the king of the Judeans be? The king of the Judeans would be in Jerusalem. So they go to Jerusalem thinking that that's actually where they're going to find the king of the Judeans. And when they ask, they're like, oh no. And then the people that they ask change the terminology. They say, where is the Christ to be born? Or where is the Messiah to be born? And when they change this actually intensifies that political point, because in this time in the first century, the Messiah, the Christ, would have been understood. This word literally just means anointed. Messiah is the Hebrew and Christ is the Greek. And this would have been very much understood as a Davidic kingly figure. And really all of the evidence, when you're talking about an intra-Jewish conversation here, all of the evidence points to where the Messiah was to be born. And what that means in this first century context is, where is David's descendant to be born? And the obvious answer is Bethlehem, because that's where David's from. Mm-hmm. And so then they go there.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because one thing you mentioned was that they go to Jerusalem first, and it doesn't say that they were led there. It's just they saw a star rose. And I guess technically it's ambiguous, but it's highly implied that the reason they went there is because the star rose. That's it.
Right.
Not because they were led. And not only that, but it's interesting because it says they have come to worship him. So you talk about in your book that this Greek word, it does have some ambiguity, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the Greek word here, we have come to worship him, and this is the only thing. This is the only words that they speak in the entire story. Whereas the one, where's this one? We have come to worship him. The word that's used here is proskuneo. It's a Greek word that is often translated as worship, which does make sense. But within Matthew's gospel, there is a little bit of ambiguity here, because proskuneo, literally, that pros, it means to bow towards, or to bow before. And so it's sort of more, without oversimplifying it almost more kind of represents the action of like what worship looks like, which is bowing. But it can also be used just as a sign of respect. So it's used in Matthew. It's used elsewhere in Matthew just to signify somebody came and bowed down before this person who was not a deity. And so here, my take on this is that they are, in the context of talking about this king, they're saying, we have come to give tribute to this king. We've come to honor this king. And then you find out later they've got very expensive gifts with them. And so my take here is that the Magi are expressing the desire to pay tribute and to perform their function, which is to be in the presence of legitimate rulers. And I think that's what Matthew's playing with here, is not so much worship, but more paying tribute. There's not really a religious dimension to what they're doing in terms of worshiping.
Yes. Yeah. And there's another aspect where these Magi in this not this context, but I guess maybe this context too, but in a lot of other contexts in Greek literature, they are kind of portrayed as tricksters. Is that right?
Yeah, they are sometimes. In fact, they are. There's an episode in Herodotus where there's these. Well, now it's late and I've had too much mental activity today. But there's this episode in Herodotus where a Magus pretends to be a king, and he is, and he's able to accomplish this for the simple fact that he looks like who is actually the king. But these Magi together, they do kind of serve as these trickster sort of characters where they usurp the true ruler, the true king, and one of them plays king for a while. And this is like not a good thing, according to Herodotus. He's sort of just telling the story. But, you also see this in Matthew. You see that kind of trickster nature of the Magi as these kinds of, clever individuals. And, they when they find out from Herod and his advisors, that the Davidic person that they're seeking is in Bethlehem, or at least he should be in Bethlehem. And Herod's like, hey, go and find him and then come back so that I can go and pay my respects as well. And they don't do this. They it's not really a trickster thing as much as it is, they have a dream in which God tells them, or an angel tells them, whomever, don't go back, right? Go home by another route. And they do. And in terms of where they're coming from the east, this big area of the east, it doesn't make any sense for them to go back to Jerusalem and then over. But they do kind of trick Herod, and Herod realizes this, which is why he is infuriated, right? It's like, well, now I don't know where going to find my Davidic successor.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because if you are, I guess, the audience of whoever's reading this, and you see, oh, Magi,
Mhm.
that's interesting. I got all these other stories about Magi, and this fits exactly the part.
Mhm.
Like, and I guess if someone could say, okay, well, it's historically accurate, I guess,
Mhm.
because that's just what Magi did. But at the same time, it's also stereotypical of what Magi
Mhm.
do. So, um, yeah, no, I just think that's really interesting how close it fits the stereotype, I guess.
Once you sort of go, and this is, I don't want to be too hard on my biblical scholar friends who have written commentaries and
Yeah.
or books on Matthew, but a lot of the treatments of the Magi that I encountered when I was doing my research for this book suggested to me, especially after I did the primary text work
Mhm.
and looking through not only Herodotus but Pliny and Strabo and all these other people. It became very, very clear to me that a lot of New Testament scholars who have written on this story have never read the primary sources,
Mhm.
because there are so many more interesting things that you can say
Mhm.
about, and obviously biblical scholars have read plenty of primary sources. I think the Magi is a story that became very comfortable for biblical scholars, like, oh, they're just Gentiles coming to
Mhm.
worship Jesus, and the Jews just want to kill him. So look at how wonderful the Gentiles are, and all this. Like, I think that's completely missing the point of what Matthew's trying to do. And that point became, I don't want to say obvious, but it became very, very clear when I spent time just plowing through these sources and going, wow, the ancient authors have a lot to say about Magi, and a lot of those things are popping up in Matthew's story.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, while you're at it, is there anything that you hadn't mentioned that comes to mind that does pop up?
Um, you mean in Matthew's story?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think Matthew's story actually contains how do I say this? I think Matthew's story actually contains a kind of snapshot of the diversity of meanings of the term magi in the ancient
Mhm.
world. Matthew's characters, there's no indication from Matthew that he sees these characters as negative or nefarious in some
Mhm.
way. Although there's been some interesting fan fiction on this topic of the Magi as people who are coming to usurp King Jesus, which is what you would expect from some sources on Magi. But it's
Hmm.
interesting because when the Magi show up in Jerusalem, there's this weird reference. If you could pop your text back up on the screen, yeah. There's this weird reference to in verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Now that's a detail that people just completely gloss over, right?
Mhm.
All that's happened so far is that Magi have shown up in Jerusalem. Okay. And then Herod is like terrified, and everyone in Jerusalem is terrified. But why? There's no reason for this unless you know the kind of sense of what Magi are in the ancient world. So, on one level, Herod could be very disturbed at this if he is assuming that magi are there to anoint a new king, perhaps, or recognize a new king by paying tribute. That would terrify a king like Herod. But I think another reason why people could be afraid is because magi are also not always positive characters. There are
Mhm.
sometimes these kind of false prophets or hucksters, or things of this nature. So there's actually more magi in the New Testament. There's two different ones in the gospel, or not in the gospel. There's two different ones in the book of Acts, which I
Mhm.
think was maybe probably written by the author of Luke. But in Acts, these magi are not good characters. There's this character named Simon who wants to purchase the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of healing, these sorts of things. He wants to purchase this from the disciples, and um, Peter is very, very not okay with this, and he curses him, and he kind of slinks away. Um, in later Christian tradition, Simon he is actually called Simon the Magus.
Mhm.
But yeah, he's a very, very negative character, and says, "Give me this." Offered them money, give me this gift, and whatever. And Peter says, "May your money perish with you. You thought you could buy the gift of God with money," and so he goes away. And so this is somebody who in the biblical text is a magus that's associated with negative things, with greed and kind of misunderstanding of the gospel. And the other one, which is even worse, is Bar Jesus, or also called Elymas, later in Acts. And he is the one who faces off against Paul. And Paul is there to, convert the official who Bar Jesus is in the court of, right? As a good magus, he's there with a ruler, and yeah, and so this he's on Paphos. Yes, the Jew, and this is a Jewish magus. Uh, Although here in verse 6 the translators have chosen sorcerer instead of wise man, right? It's the same word.
Mhm.
And he is trying to kind of get in Paul's way, and so Paul curses him, and he blinds him, and then he leaves. So
Dang.
yeah, right. And so it's interesting, right? You were going to be blind for a time, not even able to see the light of the sun. And so he just kind of has to grope out. And then, ironically, of course, then the proconsul gets converted because of what's happened to this wicked magus. And so yeah, it's, I mean, this whole question of, well, why is Herod and his entire city worried about these characters? Well,
Mhm.
because there is a sense in the ancient world that there's a range of different meanings, right? It's just like if you get approached by a lawyer, like, or if I tell a story about somebody getting approached by a lawyer, well, that depends. How you see that character is going to depend on your attitude towards lawyers, or or your attitude towards the protagonist, perhaps.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
that word can carry a range of meanings.
Mhm. So you kind of mentioned it. I could see people asking. So you say, well, in verse 3, it says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him.
Mhm.
So if I'm reading this and I don't have a clue what I'm talking about, it's the first time ever reading the passage. I'm going to read the previous verse and think, okay, maybe he's saying that because he's, I guess, freaked out because these other people are saying that they're going to go worship or honor or bow down to this other king. So is it? So you think there's more than that?
I
What
think,
what
yeah.
specifically makes you think, okay, there's more than that, other than just this outside context?
Yeah, well, and I think that there's more than that, but there's also that. So let's talk about the that first. But
Okay.
the where is the one who has been born King of the Judeans? Now your translation says King of the Jews. I don't have any trouble with that word at all. The Judean though kind of captures the ethno-political nature of this
Okay.
story in a way that I think Jews doesn't. But there's a big debate that we're not going to wade into
Mhm.
on this in my field about what to translate this word eudios, or
Mhm.
eudioi in this case. And I don't really have a 100% this or that all the time. I think context matters, but I think this is a political story. So I translate that as the one who has been born king of the Judeans, namely the rightful king of the Judeans. Now, the that here is why this matters, and why this matters to Herod in this story is that Herod is not, according to Matthew, according to even himself in this story, Herod is not the rightful king of the Judeans. Now, Herod's um, Herod's title in the first century, or in this period, Herod's title is king of the Judeans, but Herod does not have this title by his birthright. Herod has this title because the Senate in Rome gave him this title. And by the time Matthew is writing, in the late 80s, early 90s, probably, by the time Matthew is writing, the relationship uh, with Rome is not great. And so, the yeah, so what they're doing here is they're saying we want the one who's been born king of the Judeans, not the one who was appointed king of the Judeans by the Senate. And this also matters because King Herod historically is not ethnically a Judean. Herod is an Idumean, and so Herod has a reputation not only for being a brutal king, but Herod has a reputation in this time period of also being a sort of puppet king. He's not a rightful king of the Judeans like David. or David's lineage. He's not in David's lineage. He's something else entirely. And so I do think on this, there's a very basic level of the story that these magi have come and shown up, and they've not said something that surprises people. They just say, "Where's the one born king of the Judeans?" And Herod is terrified for the specific reason that he knows he's not it. And so that's the kind of dynamic here on that one level, is that title. But then I do think that there's also in the background there this sense that magi are interesting, mysterious, and kind of sometimes unpredictable unpredictable people. And so when they show up in your town, you might have a reason to be concerned.
Right, right. No, yeah, that definitely makes sense there. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I appreciate you explaining that. And I did want to ask you one more time about the whole worship thing. So, I mean, just it doesn't necessarily say, hey, like it's not gonna, they're not giving some theological doctrine or big book on who they think this boy little kid Jesus is. Okay, right? So it naturally it's going to be super ambiguous based off this
Mhm.
passage, right? So people will will think, okay, yeah, so it makes sense that they would be bowing to a king,
Mhm.
right? Um, but I mean, is it also possible that they see him as a god? Is there any reason to think they see him as a god?
I don't think Matthew gives us a reason in the story.
Okay.
I think that there is plenty in Matthew for us as readers, or for Matthew's ideal audience. I think there's plenty of room in this story for a kind of an ironic reading, right? It's just like well, I'll use an example of the centurion in Mark, who after Jesus dies, he turns and says, "Surely this was God's son," right? And everyone says, "Oh, it's a conversion moment." It's like, well, no, this is a Roman soldier sitting there going, look at God's son up here. We just killed him. But for the reader of Mark, this is an ironic moment, because the centurion is, in the story world of Mark's gospels, is saying something that's true, even though he in the story world doesn't believe it, right? And so there might be a sense of irony here in the way that Matthew has constructed his narrative. So on the one hand, the world inside the story is very much a story of leadership and politics. And so the Magi, in the context of the ancient sources that we have that describe Magi, I just don't see Magi as being interested in coming and worshiping a kingly figure. But I do see Magi as interested um, in coming to legitimate, pay tribute to a king. But then I also can see where the readers of Matthew, and it's certainly the case, that the earliest readers of Matthew are taking it in that direction of the Magi worshiping Jesus. There's sort of maybe a sense of irony there. Hey, they're bowing down and offering these gifts to this kingly figure, but we know what they're actually doing, right? Or they're prefiguring the worship of Jesus, or something along those lines. But in the story itself, I don't see much evidence of them coming and saying, "Hey, we're
Uh-huh.
looking for God in human form. Please let us know where we can find him."
Right, right, right. Yeah, no, that is super interesting when you think about it from the reader's perspective, or whoever the author of this text is, Matthew, uh, supposedly. Um, so, um, so continuing there, um, you talked about if they're kind of good, bad figures. What about wealthy? Is this
Mhm.
a wealthy kind of group?
They have expensive gifts with them. And so there's basically a couple of different ways. This is a sort of spectrum question. They have either given out of their excess, right? They are either extremely wealthy people who bring, expensive spices and gold and things like this as gifts, um, or they are people who and this is a lot of how they're interpreted in early Christian literature, or they are people who were wealthy and spent all of their money buying these gifts because they wanted to give everything to Jesus. So I think in Matthew's story world, this is probably a case where these are characters of means. That is, if people are bringing Rolexes to baby showers or whatever, you consider them to be generally wealthy. But in early Christian readings of this story, a lot of them depict them as people who scraped together everything that they had to bring these gifts. So I don't think it's a question that Matthew answers. But if I were a betting man, I would say Matthew imagines them as comfortably wealthy.
The other there's so many like nonsense theories about this passage. They just all came to mind just really quickly. I don't know.
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I can't wait to mention them. But jump in a little bit further back. So in verse 5, it says, well, of course, so it does say like, hey, we're gonna go bow down to him. So like, I can't help but wonder, like, why would this Magi group from the East, why would they care about whoever the King of the Jews is, some other people that they're not related to?
Because Matthew needs them to care about that.
What do you mean?
So this group, so my reading of this story, I don't really have any strong, I don't really have any strong desire to fight over the historicity of this story with anyone. I always tell them, like, I always tell everyone, because they say, do you think the Magi are historical figures? My answer to that is unquestionably no. I don't think that this is a historical narrative. I think Matthew has created the story. But when I say Matthew needs them to do this, Matthew's interest at the start of his gospel, and he's not subtle about any of this, Matthew's interest in this gospel at the start is Jesus's Davidic lineage. And he starts his gospel in the most boring way possible with a genealogy. And the genealogy, and whenever I teach New Testament, I get to Matthew in class, and I get to class and I say, raise your hand if you skip the genealogy, and every single hand goes up. Everyone skips the genealogy because genealogies are boring. But Matthew's genealogy, and again, look at this. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then he starts with Abraham, and then if you scroll down a little bit, you get to David, who is incidentally, if you divide this up and do the math, David is the center of the entire genealogy. And so there's Abraham to David, and all of these kings of David. Jesus is the whole point of this is that Jesus is a Davidic character, as somebody who has a Davidic lineage. And this is the funny thing about Matthew. Matthew does not trust his readers at all. So every single step of the way, Matthew is like hammering you on the head, going, do you understand what I'm doing? And here, right, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14. And so this is also screaming the name David. If you take David's name, and this is going to sound crazy for the people who are watching, but if you take David's name in Hebrew and you do the math and you take the characters and how the characters line up with numbers in the practice of Hebrew gematria, David's name, the numerical value is 14. So Matthew is not being subtle about any of this. Matthew puts David, he introduces the genealogy with David, he puts David at the direct center, and he ends with a 3 references to David's name numerically, right? So none of this is subtle. And then it goes straight into the birth of Jesus, right? So Matthew has this story that he's starting out with. This is the rightfully born king of the Judeans. He's the Davidic Christ figure. And at the start of the first century, when somebody said Christ, this is synonymous with Davidic, a Davidic character. Christ means anointed, and anointed people in this time period are Davidic kings primarily, also prophets and priests. But here we're talking about kings. And so Matthew needs an additional detail because he's concerned that people haven't gotten it yet. And so he needs that Magi story. And so on my read, he creates the story of the Magi, which is just simply perfect, right? The star rising, meaning a new king. The Magi show up looking for the new king. They then find the new king. They give him gifts. they bow before him, they go home, you have a new king, right? So I think Matthew is using that story, and I think that the Magi, the historical Magi, the people who are hanging out in Babylon and elsewhere in the Mediterranean, they're certainly interested in kings. I don't think any of them would have taken a particular interest in any kind of a Judean king. So I think this is a story that Matthew has created because it really, really, really fits well with what he's trying to do.
Hmm. Yeah, and to add on to what you're saying, not only does Matthew group these three lists into 14 to match its lovely uh, David gematria thing,
Right.
but he goes out of his way to not include to take some names out. So this whole 300-year gap, that's not correct, but he takes out a few names here, takes a few names here, and then it also adds David
Hmm.
into the if you look into the list, he adds the name twice in his calculation for 14.
Right.
So it's quite funny.
Yeah.
But um, so that is really, really interesting. I really appreciate you bringing that up there. So basically, one of the reasons that you're concluding, hey, like this is probably not historical, is because these people have no reason to care about this Jewish guy, right?
I mean, I think that my primary reason, I'm really apathetic when it comes to the history or lack thereof. I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, I'm a scholar of ancient
Uh-huh.
Christian literature, and so when we are, and this is the case pretty much when anyone is studying literature, like classicists who are studying Homer and whatever, are interested in the historical context that fits with this story, but nobody is sitting there thinking like, you know no scholar of the Odyssey, or at least not that I'm aware of, is like, where do we find the cave of the Cyclops, right? Like nobody is thinking about that because
Mhm.
it's a story that's there to serve a particular function. The only reason people are thinking, oh hey, let's look at this 2,000-year-old text, and surely this and all the other details are historical, surely it all actually happened. We don't read any other ancient literature like that. And so that's to say, though, as a scholar of literature, I am an agnostic in terms of historicity. I don't care whether the Magi story was historical or not. I
Mhm.
care about what its meaning is in Matthew's gospel. And with that, what I like about that kind of agnosticism of historicity
Mhm.
is I like that you can still talk about the meaning of a story without saying, oh, and also the meaning depends on it actually having happened. I had a conversation a couple of years ago with a friend of mine who is very, very big on all of this is historical. We might not know how it works, but it all has to be historical. And this is a good friend of mine. I respect the heck out of him, and we tend to disagree on a lot. But he and I can sit and have a conversation about meaning without looking into the pieces that we simply don't have, which is
Mhm.
like non-textual evidence of this happening, right? There's not
Mhm.
there's not any evidence, but I don't know what any evidence for or against the historicity of the story would look like, really.
Mhm. Okay. Well, maybe we'll have a conversation about that some other day.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't want to go too deep into that, but so Emily mentioned in the chat there. I'll bring it up in a second here. But so think about it like this here, Eric. This is going to blow your mind. You're going to be completely convinced here in a second
I'm glad I'm
of,
sitting down.
of
So
this.
yeah,
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
on.
You
Yeah.
need to be sitting down for this.
Mhm.
So you have Daniel, who uh, some people think it's a completely historical text. And this Daniel, he's like this Jewish guy, and you have all these Jews going into Babylon.
Mhm.
And we actually know that historically, like there actual were Jews in Babylon and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Okay. And whether they were actually Magi or the Daniel figure is a question for another time. Funny enough, I'm interviewing John Walton on Friday about his new commentary, and he does not think that the text is 100% historical, and he's a Christian. So, anyways, that's a side point. But okay, so some people have argued that, hey, these Magi here in this Matthew text, oh, that you can't see on the screen here, and I am going to share it right now. This Magi text is they come to worship him. So you say, hey, they would have no reason to think that this guy is any significance to them. But look at this, Eric. Look at this. Okay,
Hmm.
it says in Bethlehem in Judea they replied, "For this is what the prophet has said." And then
Hmm.
it quotes scripture, Hebrew scripture, or maybe Greek scripture in their eyes.
Hmm.
Um, Jewish scripture. So clearly, Eric, they had access to this text.
Hmm.
And Emily mentions it. Maybe they could have been Jewish scribes
Hmm.
that were left behind.
Hmm.
Um, what do you think about that?
Well, first, the quote that you highlighted is not the Magi talking; it's the advisors that Herod has called together, and
Oh, okay.
so yeah, so that's an important point. And so so you kind of do presume that if the Magi had that knowledge, that they would have been sharp enough to go to Bethlehem instead of Jerusalem, but they have to stop in Jerusalem because they think that's where they're heading. They're
Fair enough.
corrected they're corrected by the advisors who do know the scripture. Now,
Mm,
the theory that Emily is proposing here is actually really, really, really fascinating. And here's why. Well,
okay.
here's one of the reasons I think it's really fascinating. So,
Okay.
absolutely 100% Jewish exile in Babylon, and not everyone came home. We know that historically. We know there was plenty of Jewish people who stayed behind in Babylon.
Mhm.
Now, um, in the book of Daniel, Daniel counted
Mhm.
among this group called the Magi.
Yeah.
In this book, in this text, Daniel is given a name by the Babylonians, and his name that he's given is Balthazar, which is kind of interesting, right? Like, why is he called Balthazar? And if some of you if anyone is watching right now who grew up in a Catholic tradition where the Magi have names, one of the names of the Magi is Balthazar. Now, this name comes later. It's not in Matthew's gospel, but it comes later in the 5th, 6th, 7th century,
Hmm.
where the Magi get the names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. And these are
Mm.
different names, different spellings, whatever. Um, Now, I didn't do much with the Balthazar connection in my book because
Mhm.
you can't really do everything. But
Mhm.
I think it's a really, really fascinating, another one of those instances where I don't think Matthew sees these as Jewish characters, but I do think that early Christian readers did, or some of them anyway. I think they saw them as, at least in this case, whoever decided that one of the names the Magi is going to be Balthazar. And well, who decided that? Well, people that were reading it, and then that was then later recorded in a text. But
Mm.
but I think it's really interesting to note that one of the Magi in Matthew,
Mm.
in tradition, picks up the name that Daniel is given in Babylon. And so I do think there's actually that. I don't think that's I don't it's a left field theory. Is it left field or right field? That's the bad one. Anyway,
Left
it's one
field.
of the it's
You're
one
out in
of the
left field.
if you're out in yeah, you're out in left field. So it is a bit of a left field theory, but I actually think there's something to it. I think it's a really, really interesting connection.
Yeah. Yeah. So early people thought it, but how early is early, right? So 5th, 6th century is not actually that early.
It's a few hundred years after Matthew at least, but also there's this whole and this is where history gets a little bit sloppy, right? When you are um you know a tradition, when you have a tradition pop up in a text, it's either because that tradition already exists in the air, or
Mhm.
the author is simply making it up completely. So, like, if we could take it back to Matthew's Magi story, is it actually the case what I said, where Matthew makes up this story? Maybe, maybe not. It might have also been a story that Matthew heard and that he liked and made a couple tweaks to, and then kind of called it good.
Hmm.
But yeah, it takes a few hundred years at least for the names to pop up. But after they do, like when I've talked to Catholic crowds
Mhm.
about this story before, um, many will swear up and down that the names of the Magi are in Matthew, and they just aren't. Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Well,
That's
because it's such a short story, and it's such a
yeah.
vague story, and we read in all these details,
Mhm.
and so all of us are imagining these stories in light of other things that we've heard
Mhm.
um about them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, uh, Michael Heiser has. Are you familiar with Michael Heiser?
I am.
Okay. So he had an interpretation of Revelation, which
Mm,
I'm no expert on that topic. It could be possible that there is. I can't remember what chapter it was, but there is a text, and it seems like it possibly could be talking about like astrology and reading the stars and something about Jesus's maybe Jesus's birth. I don't know for sure the full view there, but what he does is he says, okay, I think this maybe is what the Magi were thinking. This is what they saw in the sky
mm,
is, and that's how they knew to go. And then Revelation talks about what they saw,
hmm.
and I mean, I think there's a number of problems with that uh, issue with that conversation there. But something that I did find really interesting there is that if um, if this whole story um, I kind of lost my track there, but maybe it'll come back to me. Did you have any thoughts about that fun idea?
Um, I don't. So I don't know Michael Heiser's work very
Yeah.
well. I never met the guy anywhere, although he had I think he passed a few years ago, right?
Mhm.
He had me blocked on every single social media platform.
What?
I have no idea. I have no idea why. So I don't.
Oh, that's so funny.
I'm prefacing all this by saying I consider the person to be a little bit of a mystery. I've never really
Yeah.
blocked somebody I've never interacted with, but um, that idea, I would say, connecting the historical magi with in Matthew with something in Revelation or whatever. This is one of the reasons why I emphasize the need to just look at the literature and to look at what we have access to.
Okay.
And so, what we have access to are the texts. We don't have access to any historical kernels. Or a lot of historical kernels that may or may not be behind those texts. And
Mhm.
so I think that a theory like this, which brings in Revelation and an artifact in Revelation to explain something in Matthew that involves some sort of hypothetical priestly, hypothetical figures that were part of a real historically priestly caste. Um, I think it's a lot of moving pieces, and
Mhm.
and generally speaking, I am one of those. The simplest explanation tends to be the correct one, and so I think both of these authors were probably interested in astrology or interested in the heavens, and Revelation more on this in the sense of like the apocalyptic value of stars and watching stars. Like, when there's something going on, when the stars are misbehaving, right? When you see, well, like last night, right? There was the meteor shower. We didn't see any meteors, but there was a meteor shower last night, a pretty
Mhm.
big one. And in the ancient world, if they're not able to predict, like, well, this is something that's going to happen, and all of a sudden you look up and you're an ancient person who doesn't really know what the stars are, you probably think they're like quasi divine beings or heroes or something like this. But you look up and you see a bunch of them streaking across the sky. Well, if you don't know what's going on, if you don't know that, you were presuming then that um, the heavens are misbehaving. They've lost their kind of um, predictable obedience. And so I think that Revelation is interested in that, right? Stars are falling and there's all of this crashing into the earth and whatever. And I think Matthew's doing something a little bit different. But yeah, I think connecting the two, I'm not super convinced by it, but I'm interested enough to go look it up. So yeah.
I don't know if you want to go through all that effort there.
I've read a
Um,
lot of weird stuff
yeah,
for this book, and continue to read a lot of weird stuff for it.
yeah.
So.
That is what's fun about this conversation. It's just one of those things where it's like it's so vague that people can just make up whatever they want. Not necessarily that that's what Heiser was doing, but
Well,
what were
and
you
I
saying?
think I don't necessarily think well, I do think there's a bit of making things up, but I think a lot of interpretation, especially the type that Michael Heiser is engaged in with
Mhm.
what you're describing there, I think a lot of that interpretation is stemming from a place where all of these texts have to make sense in light of each other, and that
Mm.
they all have to connect to each other in meaningful ways. And honestly, I think that presupposition um I think it produces some really, really strange things. This
Mhm.
kind of, like, if you read, this is not necessarily in the same gear, but if you read some of this like numerology stuff that a lot of evangelical groups are putting together these days, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's just not that complicated,
Mm.
like 7,567 divided by 2. It's like, well, that doesn't work, but it does if you add this number here from over here and then this and this. It's just like, oh my god, there's so much easier ways.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And what I was going to say earlier before I forgot was, so there's under this hypothesis, the idea is that maybe this thing that the Book of Revelation is talking about, this knowledge came from maybe Second Temple literature or maybe from Babylon, and that's how the Magi knew about it because they were connected with the Jews.
Yeah.
And yeah, just a lot of speculation there. But um, yeah, so um, maybe I'll talk about that in some other video, that specific view. But that was more just for fun.
Mhm.
Anyway, so let's see here. Um, what about the gifts? Okay, so tell me
Mhm.
about the gifts. So people have all kinds of odd interpretations about that. Uh, how have people interpreted them, and do you think they have any significance?
Yeah, so I'll start with how have people interpreted them. So it's actually one of my favorite kind of despite how curmudgeonly I sound about this stuff, I am not myself a theological interpretation. I'm certainly not a theological interpretation. I am not a theological interpreter, but I think a lot of theological interpretations are very interesting. One of the ones that we see about the gifts is that the gifts are meant to symbolize pieces of Jesus's identity,
Mm,
according to the author of Matthew. And so the idea here goes that, well, Matthew is trying to tell the story that Jesus is a king. Jesus is a sort of priestly figure, and or God, and Jesus is a man who's going to die. And so the gifts in this interpretation uh, signify this. So gold signifies his kingship. Frankincense, which is a type of incense made from gum resin of a tree in the Middle East, frankincense would have signified that he is a priestly figure who would have offered incense, or a deity to whom incense would have been offered. And then myrrh, so the interpretation goes, is supposed to foreshadow his death, because according to this interpretation, myrrh was a burial ointment. So I think it's an interesting interpretation. It's certainly early, and it's certainly popular in certain early Christian circles. I actually don't think that this is what Matthew has in mind. I think that Matthew has, in this case, imagined three of the most expensive items that he can fathom. And I think that that's what he has these, kingmakers coming
yeah.
to give Jesus is gold, obviously a valuable substance, limited commodities, frankincense and myrrh, both these gum resins, turned into in frankincense and incense, and then myrrh as a spice of some sort. But
Mhm.
the reason I don't think that Matthew has this in mind of like, you know, these are signifying pieces of Jesus's identity is because Matthew doesn't, like I said earlier, Matthew is not a subtle author, and Matthew also does not trust his readers. And so, if
Mm,
Matthew wants a connection to be made by the reader, he is going to help them make that connection. And
mm,
the main reason that I depart from this idea that these gifts are meant to signify anything about Jesus himself aside from his kingship is the myrrh. And so myrrh is it is the case in the ancient world that you could use myrrh to flavor or to scent ointments and these sorts of things. And so it's not inconceivable of it being used as a burial ointment. In fact, now my memory's failing me, but I think in John, did they talk about myrrh being used to anoint the body? Um, it doesn't matter. The part that does matter for Matthew is that Matthew one of the things that almost all biblical scholars agree on is that Matthew is using Mark as a source text, and that he's borrowing certain things from Mark in the construction of his own story. In Mark, at the crucifixion of Jesus, the people gathered around the cross offer Jesus a drink. They offer him a drink of wine that is mixed with myrrh. And it's just this really, really fascinating episode. The same episode occurs in Matthew, but Matthew changes it. Matthew changes it so that it's not a wine mixed with myrrh, it's wine mixed with gall. And so Matthew, if Matthew had intended for the myrrh at the story of Jesus's birth to signify his death, he just destroyed the connection that
Right.
would have helped readers draw that conclusion. And so, but it's almost, I don't think he was intentionally saying, I want people to not think about the birth in this thing, but it's almost like that's what he was saying. It's like, well, Mark has myrrh and wine, and I'm going to go ahead and just swap that. I'm going to swap that myrrh out with gall, going from like a nice tasting wine to a very bitter sort of
Right.
poison wine. So,
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, my first thoughts are kind of the same there. If you're going to try to make some type of symbolic or parallel or callback, they almost certainly would use the same word, right?
yeah, right. I mean, yeah, and if Matthew was the one, if Matthew was meaning for readers to make that connection, then Matthew certainly would have included the myrrh at the crucifixion, or he would have included, he would have included something about Jesus being anointed with, myrrh ointment or something like that, but he doesn't.
Right. Yeah. And then the frankincense, it's only used in Revelation,
Mhm.
and then the gold, it's used a few other places here in Matthew.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, I don't know. You're gonna have to make a much stronger argument there, other than just vague parallels, right?
Well, and again, I do think that it's an interesting exercise to read these texts theologically. I think especially once you've got your sense of, well, what did this text mean to the author, right? I'm postmodern enough to say readers and what they bring to the table, that does matter. However, we also have to be in the business first of figuring out what these texts would have meant in their original
Mhm.
context. And after you figure that out, there's all sorts of cool, interesting connections that you can make that I think are legitimate construals of meaning.
Mm.
I just, my personal read of this is that Matthew's not quite interested in that. I think Matthew sees these as expensive gifts.
Right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So I would be remiss to not mention it, because this is what a lot of people talk about. You get into a lot of other crazy theories here as well with the star.
Mhm.
So this star that they follow,
Mhm.
you so you kind of mentioned it before. So it doesn't appear to lead them the first part, but
Right.
then it somehow shows up right above their house.
Right.
So there's one hand, there's the scientific approach many people read, and they're like, oh, well, this is it was this constellation, and then this happened, and then somehow it showed up above, but that doesn't really make a sense to me as a
Mhm.
uneducated person in stars. Apparently, some people say it's the highest in the sky, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me either, and that's how they knew. But in your research there, uh, what do you think Matthew was trying to say?
Oh, yeah. So I think Matthew is first of all using the star language to surface that trope from antiquity of stars and astronomical events being tied to ascensions and rulers and these sorts of things. One of the details that I do get into with my book is the Julian star, the comet that shows up after Caesar's assassination in Rome. And the comet is seen by the kind of just the people in Rome as signifying that that Julius Caesar had become deified. And so I think Matthew is, when Matthew includes the story of the star, I think that he is playing with that imagery of stars being linked to important people who are leaders. But it's interesting, though, in Matthew's story that there aren't two stars. There's one star, but there's one star that behaves very, very differently in two different ways. So, you've noted this first one, right? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. There's all sorts. Oh my gosh, I had to allow myself like one or two maybe of these per day when I was trying to do research on what have astrologers, I say this, I say loosely, right? Astronomers, rather, not astrologers. What have astronomers said about the so-called Star of Bethlehem? And the reason I put those in quotes is not to say that they aren't real astronomers, but there's a lot of astronomers out there who are also very committed Christians, which is fine. And when they read biblical texts, they are doing so without any of the critical tools that biblical scholars have. And so the conclusions that they're coming to are all just wrong. And or maybe they're right, and we just don't have any way of verifying it, but they are almost all they make me roll my eyes. But here's why. So there's this case to be made of like, well, in this year, there was a supernova. In this year, there was a planetary conjunction. In this year, Halley's Comet appears. And Halley's Comet appeared within like 10 years of Jesus's birth. Maybe it was Halley's Comet that Matthew was talking about. At the end of the day, if Matthew had a specific astronomical event in mind, it is lost to us today. We have a very, very good sense of what the sky looked like 2,000 years ago. But we also don't know when Jesus was born. We don't know what year he was born, and we don't know what month in the year that he was born. And so there's really no way, if Matthew is trying to draw his attention or trying to draw readers' attention to a specific star or some other thing in the heavens, if he does have a specific thing in mind, it's completely lost to us today because we just don't know the timing of Jesus's birth. We just don't. But that hasn't stopped people from trying, right? There's all these planetary conjunction theories and all of this kind of stuff. I just think that's very misguided because I think that in Matthew's story, Matthew doesn't care about this star as an actual star. He cares about it as the thing that sends the Magi to Jerusalem. But then the reason I say he doesn't care about it is that he turns it into something in the second part of the story that does not act like a star at all, right? As soon as they read Jerusalem, or as soon as they leave Jerusalem, the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. There's no star in the world that can mark the location of a house. It just isn't, right? So this is like this, like almost like low flying orb. I have read theories, right, that it's a UFO, and those are very entertaining. They're about as plausible though as, he's talking about this comet or this planetary conjunction. Like there's, I think it's more the idea of the star, and the star is a character in the story that enables the Magi to do what they're meant to do.
Yeah. There's a lot of different interesting things going on here. So I could see from, like, if I'm putting myself through this, supposed Matthew, the author's thoughts here. I mean, of course, like maybe he's just retelling his source or whatever that is, or hypothetically he made it up, and this is kind of like his literary device, as you were talking about. But obviously when these types of things are like, they're not just made out of thin air. They have ideas like the Magi and what stars did and all this other stuff. It's not completely made up. So if he's thinking, hey, so the Magi, they're these like people that look at the sky and they maybe tell the future and all this other stuff, then it makes sense why they're going to be led by the stars, right? But then I could see a situation where it's like, well, like the goal, Matthew's goal is not to write some like extremely 21st century historical narrative of what's going on. So like he's perfectly fine with saying, hey, this star just stopped right in front of him. That's how we know.
Right.
Or I could see that some scholars argue that, hey, stars they have connections with, like, divine beings,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
angels. I,
Yep.
I don't know how that would have been viewed at this time.
Mhm.
So there are some scholars that think, hey, forget all this astrology stuff
Mhm.
or astronomy and all that. It's just an angel. I think McClellan said that at one
Mhm.
point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Plato said that all the stars are gods, and there's plenty of Greek philosophers who say that they're like deceased and ascended heroes of some nature. Second Temple
Mhm,
Judaism, the traditions tend to center more on them. Yeah, they're sort of angelic beings,
mhm,
something along those lines. I don't necessarily think that's out of the realm of possibility for what Matthew's doing here. I'm not completely sure that that's what Matthew's doing here, but yeah, that's absolutely the case in the ancient world of people looking up and what are those things? Well, I mean, how do you tell if you don't have telescopes, right? And so yeah, but there are later traditions that take that kind of idea on of the stars as living beings. There's a one of the most fascinating Magi texts is the Syriac Revelation of the Magi, where there's like 12 of these characters, and they're all living way far in the east, and their land is given a name. It's the land of Shir, and in this story, they are sort of separatist Jews, I guess is a way of describing them. They are sort of out in the eastern land, like awaiting the return of the light that was in Eden. And so it's just really, really interesting. Again, a fascinating little story, but there's this so the story goes, there's this bright light that hovers over the tree of either the tree of knowledge or the tree of life. But anyway, when Adam and Eve are naughty, the light gets sucked back up into heaven. And so the Magi are the ones who are out in the east waiting for the return of the light. And when it returns, it's Jesus himself. And so Jesus, this kind of star, the star has come down and it shapeshifts. They all see something different when they look at it, but it's very much Jesus. It's, there's one of them sees a crucified person, one of them sees a baby, all of this. And then the star very much in that story takes on this personality of, yeah, stars are living things, and this one has come down to enable us to travel west, and it like levels the mountains in the desert for them, it prepares food for them, all of this stuff. It's really, really wild. Probably not what Matthew has in mind, but what Matthew has in mind is also weird.
yeah, 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 definitely. So I guess it's not terribly obvious. I guess hypothetically, there could be a star flying through the sky, or as it says at the beginning, it rose,
Hmm.
and then all of a sudden, instead of being like a normal star, it decides to come to Earth and say, "Hey, this is exactly where Jesus is."
I mean, yes. Well, that's the story Matthew's telling, right? So that
Uh,
that's where we get into this realm of like, does Matthew think that the star is actually an angelic being? I mean,
yeah.
maybe, right? Not all. A lot of ancient authors did see that as what stars were,
Hmm.
um, but it's very much. I think Matthew's story itself kind of bucks any attempt to identify what star might Matthew have had in mind. I think Matthew himself is saying
Mm,
like well, this thing rises in the east and then it like disappears and reappears in Jerusalem and
mhm,
like homes ahead of them to this house in Bethlehem. Like Matthew's not stupid. I think Matthew knows that actual stars don't do that. But
hmm.
if he's imagining the stars as living beings, then that perhaps helps to make sense of it. But it's almost like it's like the stories in Genesis when people try to read the creation story in Genesis, the first creation story of the 6 days and whatever.
Mhm.
When they try to read that as a scientific account, um, the the story itself pushes back against that reading. I mean, you have the sun is created, on the fourth day, and we've already had 3 days without a sun. Like, how do you count days without a sun? How do you have plants without a sun, right? And so it's the story itself is sort of, if you read it carefully, the story itself is saying like, science isn't the point here. And so with Matthew, like astronomy is not the point here. Kingship is.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I I guess it's just really obviously I have no interest in reading it as some type of scientific account or thinking like this is going to map onto some type of star. I
Hmm.
guess theoretically possible. I guess it's hypothetically possible.
Oh yeah.
But I do find that really interesting. So I appreciate there's extra thoughts there.
Mhm.
Was there anything else we didn't mention in the book that you really like to talk about, or have we summed up all your thoughts?
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. I think one of the reasons this story is so interesting and kind of, I almost say timeless, is that it, when you go and read it and you see just how vague it is, it is a story that is, because of its vagueness and because of its mystery, it kind of gets sucked up and reappropriated in all these different
Hmm.
contexts. And so that's, I mean, that's one of the things I find the most interesting about it is not just what do we find in Matthew, but how have people taken these characters and reimagined them
Hmm.
and put themselves into the story or use the story to legitimate their own stuff. But yeah, it's a really, really fascinating. It's a really, really fascinating story. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So before you go, I just want you to help me. So could you help me find where it says there are three wise men? Which verses was that?
Aha. Matthew never says that there were three. This is one of the fun trivia things that scholars like myself like to point out. So I think the number three is very, very early, but it's also not
Uh,
univocal in the tradition. So they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Interestingly, the word for treasures in Greek is thesaurus. So anyway, the thesaurus is a treasury of words, right? It's kind of a funny thing that makes me laugh. But yeah, the number three comes from that three gifts. And so is it the case like Matthew, does Matthew think that there were three? I don't know, probably, but not necessarily. So there's a one of the catacombs in Rome that depicts the Magi,
mhm.
has four of them, and like I said, the Syriac Revelation of the Magi has 12. There are other texts where there are seven. I believe the Armenian Gospel of Infancy has not three. I might be misremembering that. It's been a little while, but yeah, you see all these different pieces of art up there. I don't know if the catacombs that I'm thinking of. Yeah, there's a lot of threes. Yeah, I'll have to find. Maybe I can send it to you, and I'll put in a. You can put in a link or something like that.
Not a big
Um,
deal.
yeah, yeah. Peter and yeah, I can't remember what they are or which catacomb it is, but they're like decoratively surrounding this other thing. And this little image right here. So if you stop right there, the Instagram one, and then the Wikimedia Commons. So the one with the yellow, red, and green magus, and then the one next to it with the image of the person over to the left, that big marble slab. So both of those were found in the same catacomb in Rome. They were found in
Hmm.
this. They're found in the catacomb of Priscilla, and the one on the left is. This is actually probably a good place to. These are the two. These are two of the oldest, probably the two oldest images of the Magi that
Hmm.
still exist. And so the one on the left is in a place in the Priscilla catacomb called the Greek Chapel, and it's above a doorway. Really, really beautiful space. And then the other image on with with Severa. So this is one of my actually these this is my favorite image of the Magi. So this is what's called a loculus cover. It would have been put over the in the catacombs in the hallways. They have all the different niches where they put the bodies.
Hmm.
And so this would have been a cover that would have gone over one of those niches. And this is a niche that would have been would have held a child who was apparently named Severa, and so the Latin there, Severa and Deo vivas, Severa, may you live in God, and then the image of the Magi approaching Mary and Jesus, and then there's a star up there, and then that figure behind who's pointing to the star is either Joseph or Balaam from Numbers, actually. But it's a really, really interesting image, and I wrote about it in one of the chapters of my book, actually before I had ever had a chance to see it. It's in the Vatican Museum in Rome, Vatican Museums in Rome, and every time I had gone before I wrote my book, the exhibit was always closed. And so
Oh wow.
it was closed for like renovations for so many years, and then finally I went there in 2022 with students, and it was like, and I just, like, the book was being published that year. It's like, I can't wait to see Severa. I'm going to see her this time. And I went, and it was closed again for some kind of renovation. And I went back the next summer with students, and it was open. So I finally got to go and like sit, 6 inches from it and, take pictures. It's very, very small though, beautiful. But I like to think about it in the context of people who are using the Magi story. Why would parents or somebody else have used the Magi story to memorialize the death or the life, or rather, of this child? What kind of message is being sent there, and message of generosity or curiosity seeking, those sorts of things. It's a beautiful, beautiful image though.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, it's a little different than what I'm wearing if I'm supposed to be a Magi. So,
well, if I knew we were going to end up on the Loculus cover, I would have told you to go get a cape. And I don't know if you're wearing a skirt, but they apparently are. So,
well, I'm definitely not wearing a backwards Pope outfit. So, there might be a little bit of a gown in there or something.
Okay.
And this is definitely not a Disney wizard hat, but
definitely not.
So I feel like I really messed it up, but we didn't ask you. I hate to keep you here, but Zoroastrianism. So lots of people, and I watched a video just the other day, and they were like, these Magi were Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrians.
Yes,
maybe. So, do we have any reason to think that?
There are texts from the ancient world that describe Zoroastrians as magi, and in fact, Zoroaster himself is called a magus at one point. And I do a little tiny bit in my book about Zoroastrians, but really not to a lot of people's satisfaction. But the reason I don't do a whole lot with it is that I just don't think it's all that relevant for Matthew, because Zoroastrians are so there's such a strong kind of ritual religious component there, and that doesn't really come up in Matthew's story, because I think the story is mostly them. I mean, if they're to be understood as magi, like other magi we find in sources in the ancient world, then they're almost certainly advisory figures who are also trained religious specialists, but their religious function doesn't really seem to play that much of a role in Matthew. And so if Matthew had imagined this group of Zoroastrians coming, that's even making the definition of, or that's making his identification of magi even more specific, like not just magi, Zoroastrian magi. And if he's being that specific, if they're about their identity, that is a detail that he's not hinted at all, at least on my read.
Yeah, so people kind of assume that it's just this one specific group is the Magi, but there's a lot of different, I guess, tropes, stereotypes of what they call a Magi. Yes. And as you were talking about, so they have a very specific religious connotation. So maybe you could use that as an argument to say, hey, if this is what Matthew was portraying it as, it would have, I mean, I guess technically, theoretically it's possible they could be it, but we would expect there to be some religious connotation if that's what he was describing, if that was his goal.
I think that if this was a story about them as religious specialists, as priests, sacrificers, these sorts of things, I would have expected Matthew to include some kind of detail about that. But instead, they're just doing the things that magi in the ancient world do, which is validating kings, interpreting dreams, interpreting stars, those sorts of things.
Yeah, but not the normal one, because the normal magi is not looking for the Jewish king. So that's a little different.
Well, I don't know though. I don't know any ancient magi. So yeah.
All right.
Cool.
But I was just messing with you there.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Eric. And
Yeah,
if I
pleasure.
didn't tell everybody, here is his fun, great little book there. I'm really
It's on
interested to
sale.
see how you got 30 reviews there, that and only 4.2, because you must have had some really mad people at you or something.
Yeah, I think there was a few people who were very, very disappointed that it was not. Oh, here we go.
Oh no!
I try to
What?
make it a point to. Oh yeah, well written, but not a book for people looking for it to boost your faith. Well, it's a good thing. That's not why I wrote it. So yeah. Anyway,
a waste of readers' time, Eric. Gosh.
No. Yeah, and I do talk about lamb in the book. It's great. But yeah, you just can't. Ooh, there's somebody named Woot Woot who left a review. What does that one say? I learned more about the characteristics of who the Magi were and they ways they were both loved and hated. Wow. 4 people found this helpful, and so did he, and yet he gave me 4 stars. Come on,
people are tough. People are tough.
Classic Woot Woot. So anyway, yeah, no, I don't know how that happened, but yeah, it's on sale right now. So for $20, you can either have that or a cup of coffee. Yeah.
And if you feel bad, you can leave Eric a 5-star review as a thank you for coming on the channel.
Yeah.
And that way it'll make up for all the people that are upset because he said that something about not boosting the faith. But
yeah. I'm never going to sleep. I'm not going to sleep for the rest of the week. Thanks a lot, Zach. So.
Yeah, well, it happens. I'm a blessing to people in some ways. But thank you so much for coming on here, Eric. It's been a pleasure. And everybody else, make sure to subscribe, get the book. Really interesting stuff. And I hope you guys have a good one.
Thank you.